Well, the iPhone 10 faked everybody out, and I'm here at Microsoft to talk cloud as well. Welcome to Fortt Knox West Coast Edition. I am John Fortt of CNBC. Here on Microsoft's campus outside Seattle, Josh Lipton joins me from San Francisco. Hey, Josh.
How you doing, John?
I'm good. You've been up a long time, Josh. You've been up since 2:30. Well, I think you were on air at 2:30 in the morning, West Coast time, because Apple had earnings. You and I were talking about this in the days leading up to it. iPhone 10, what if the numbers come in this way? What if they come in that way? What about average selling prices? What happened?
Well, what happened is, so heading into those results, John, we talked about how the stock was down about 10%. Investors had been trying to figure out what demand was like for that iPhone franchise, specifically the iPhone 10. I think a lot of investors and certainly a lot of analysts had been trying to pick up clues by watching Apple's supply chain. So you had news out of companies like Taiwan Semi and AMS, and maybe they gave some downbeat forecasts, and investors read into that and thought, oh man,
let's
iPhone 10 is going to be a dud. Yeah.
The stock is up 5%. The street got it wrong. iPhone 10 doing just fine. I mean, they didn't, sell out of iPhones or anything, but it was still, bottom line, for me, it was still the best selling iPhone model started, and it's starting at $999. Who expected that?
Yeah, and so, no, that's a fair point. So, and when I spoke to Apple CEO Tim Cook about those results, and when I went in there, John, the first question had to be, let's dig into iPhone 10 demand, right? And I obviously was going to be, the question was going to be, so, Tim, last time we chatted, after the last time you reported, you had told me at that point, the iPhone 10 was your best seller. Is that still true? If you had been listening to a lot of the analysts and reading a lot of the commentary, no way you thought that was going to be true. But in fact, it was, and Cook said that is still my top seller. The iPhone 10 week in and week out is my top seller. It was true for the March quarter, and it was true for the December quarter, he said.
He should have brought Dr. Dre with him to that, right? And just done, I don't know, that line, what you think I sold them all? Talk about phones like I ain't got none, right? I mean, people were sleeping on Tim. Were they not? Yeah. But what this comes down to is people thought that they could look at the suppliers to the iPhone and figure out how Apple is doing. And we've seen this quarter after quarter, year after year at this point. You can't do it. I mean, sometimes you can get a little bit of a sense of what's happening in the broader market, but I mean, and I keep saying this to people, you can look at an individual data point and it's telling you something, but it's not telling you everything, because one of the major things people missed in this case was what was happening with iPhone channel inventory. In other words, there's a difference between how many phones Apple is making and pushing out into retail and how many they're actually selling. And it turns out they had made a lot of 10s, right? And they had them already. They didn't need to make as many to sell in the quarter. So they sold through a lot more 10s than people expected, and they were reading the supply chain wrong in part because of that, right?
Right. And here's a point about that, because, John, I would bet good money that next time Apple reports, when we're talking about the June quarter, I'm sure we're going to be talking about supply data points again. Even though, what is Cook's response to that? It's been pretty consistent. I mean, Cook has said, listen, kind of echoing what you said, John, listen, Cook will say, my supply chain is big and it is complex, and you're going to have a tough time kind of extrapolating a trend from just a few data points out of it. And I'm not saying trust Tim Cook. I mean, we're journalists. We don't say, okay, Tim, just because you say don't look at the supply chain and assume everything, don't look at it. But I think from this point, we can see from a journalistic perspective, and certainly investors can see, that historically, these things are not perfectly correlated. You've got to look, yes, at supply chain information overall, but don't believe it tells you the whole story. Also look at the overall trend. Look at the loyalty of the adherents, the buyers of these various platforms. Consider things like services also as a factor. How much did services play into this? I mean, it was up, what, 31% for Apple year over year.
Apple calls it services. Right. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer because there's a lot of kind of transactional retail built in there too, right?
So 31%, that was a record $9.2 billion in the quarter. And that was certainly top of a conversation on the call. I know Morgan Stanley's analyst, Katie Huberty, very well-respected analyst, said to her that was really the highlight of the report for her. I know her colleague, Jim Cramer, was talking about it a lot today. You know, when I asked Cook about that, he'll say the drivers were pretty broad-based, right? He'll say it was App Store, it was Apple Music, it was Apple Pay. And obviously that excites investors because now, you know, your services are about, let's call it 15% of revenue, but it's a faster growing business, a higher margin business, and so it gets bulls pretty excited when they see numbers like that. The question is, you know, do you think that growth rate can sustain itself? 30% is pretty monster. I was talking to Gene Munster of Loop Ventures, who's been following Apple a long time, and he actually thought when he saw that print, he told me he thought there must have been like a one-time payment in there. He was kind of thrown by it, and he thinks that, you know, he would expect that to moderate. He would be looking, he said, for more like 20% growth in the quarter ahead.
Huh. Yeah, well, I mean, services, the way Apple defines it, includes every, you know, share of every paid app that gets downloaded from the App Store, as well as things like Apple Music. Apple Care, I think, is in there too. So some of it is services, some of it is in-app purchases, even in games, like if you're playing Fortnite on mobile, and Apple's getting a share of that. I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not sure that should necessarily count as services, but isn't the question whether, as people wait longer to buy new phones, companies like Apple are able to get them to buy other stuff in the meantime, whether it is extra cloud services or extra equipment in games or a new battery for the phone to make it last longer or screen repair or on and on and on and on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. You know, when I asked, by way to that point, when I asked Cook yesterday, you know, one concern with some skeptics is that you do have this lengthening upgrade cycle, right? So people are waiting longer to upgrade their phones, and there was some interesting data on that I saw there from Consumer Intelligence Research Partners had said that they did this recent survey and they found that 60% of consumers were owning their iPhone for 2 years or more, right? And that was up from about 50% just 12 months ago. So just kind of playing into that theme, at least here in the U.S., of people holding onto their iPhones for longer. And I asked Cook how he thought about that. And one counter he made to that, he made a couple points. One, he said, is that when we talk about these upgrade cycles lengthening, it's not true at the same rate in every country and every geography. But also, he said, like, to him, what's important is that that iPhone active install base keeps growing double digits. And I think his point there is, you know, he has this huge install base of devices that he's going to try to keep selling services through. And that's what gets bulls excited when you see a pop of 30% like that.
Yeah, I guess the question is, can they figure out stuff to sell to those people that sort of makes up for the lack of that $600 to $1,000 pop that comes from buying a new phone more often. Yeah, interesting stuff. But speaking of services, I'm here. Go ahead.
Go on. I'm sorry, John. One question I had for you was, because we're talking about the iPhone 10, did you think there was a read-through on that print to what we're going to hear in the September timeframe for new phones? Here's why I asked you, because when I talked to Gene Munster, I asked him for a read-through. If you think the iPhone 10 is that strong and it's your top seller, and Munster's feeling was, well, if that's true, then he really thinks what gets introduced in the fall is not only a phone that's newer and bigger, but he thinks you could see a price point get pushed up to $1,400. Your take on that?
Ooh, $1,400. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've got an iPhone 10. I don't love it, but it's okay. I actually like Touch ID better from a convenience perspective. You know, with Touch ID, you can unlock your phone when it's sitting on the nightstand next to you or on the desk when you're typing. You don't have to like lean over it or do that. With the 10, with Face ID, you do. So I don't love that, but what I do like is the additional screen real estate. But look, from Apple's perspective, there were all these ridiculous rumors that Apple was going to kill the iPhone 10 because it was just too expensive.
Right. Yeah.
I think what this quarter did was show, no, they're not going to kill the iPhone 10. Enough people are buying it and like it, that we're going to see an extension of that line. And what Apple was able to do, I mean, correct me where I'm wrong here, but I think the unit growth year over year for iPhones was just 2%, but the revenue growth was something like 14%. I mean, at a time when people are buying fewer phones, Apple's figuring out how to get more money anyway, which is at the core of what Apple tries to do. This idea that they have that if you design it a little bit better and you focus on the look and feel, that people will eventually find more value at the core.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. So units were muted, John, and really that's not, I mean, look what analysts are actually projecting for the year. That's what they're looking for. If you look at estimates for fiscal 18, they're really looking for around 220, 221 million iPhone units. And to put that in perspective, the year before it was 217. So not much unit growth expected. But to your point, they're charging more and people are paying more. So actually the units may be modest, but the street's looking for iPhone revenue growth double digits. I think around 16% there.
Now, I said I've got an iPhone 10, so, I'm platform agnostic, though. A lot of what I do on my, I happen to subscribe to Office 365. I happen to be here at Microsoft today. Want to talk cloud a little bit. I was just at what they call here the Azure Cloud Collaboration Center. It's basically an area where they've got up a map of the entire world, all the places, all the regions where they've got cloud data centers, and they're able to see how is it performing. Are there security issues? Is there somebody on it? And down the line, as they look at those issues, hey, when there's a problem in storage, is there also a problem in compute, and vice versa? Can we apply artificial intelligence to see what's likely to happen next so that we can get things up and running, flowing better, more quickly than we could in the past? Want to play you some of that interview with Jason Zander right now, earlier on CNBC. Check out what he had to say about developments in the cloud. Quite a facility you've got here. Thanks for having me. I think it's been 5 years since you moved over, 5+, to the Azure team. Now you've got parts of Windows, core development under you as well. Give people a sense of how that combination of Azure and core Windows is going to allow Microsoft to move more quickly in key strategic areas.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for being here. We're really excited about the facility and being able to show it off. The benefit of bringing Windows over, we have some of the best systems engineering talent around the world actually working on Windows. So bringing them in along with the Azure team, it allows us to concentrate from the silicon all the way up to where the users experience our products. It's going to be more integrated and focused than ever before on our pivot around intelligent cloud and intelligent edge.
Now talk to me about security. And this map up here, things would be lighting up if things were going wrong, I take it. Recently, Microsoft announced Azure Sphere, an idea that you're going to be able to have chip designs that are able to call back to the cloud and get better intelligence how to fight off attacks. To what degree was your team working on that for maybe a long period of time, and how much more hardware design and chip work do you anticipate doing in building out the cloud?
Yeah, and Azure Sphere is a really cool example, actually, because it actually borrows some of the silicon technology that we built originally in Xbox to actually secure hardware, and then connectivity back to the cloud. And of course, we've had Xbox Live and connectivity there as well. So it leverages those two things together. And as you mentioned, as we get more out to this intelligent edge, more devices around the world, more of them spread out, we need to make sure that they're up to date. We need to make sure they're secure. And that's just one example of how we can do that.
So are you going to be doing a lot more hardware and chip development? I mean, we tended to think of Microsoft traditionally as being a software player, but with Azure, you're doing more infrastructure, more chips too?
No, that's absolutely correct. In fact, we've actually contributed silicon designs that are for the data centers, massive scale, into the Open Compute project, actually open source. So we actually design a lot of our own silicon that goes into the data centers. And of course, we have things like the HoloLens, HPU, Azure Sphere, as you mentioned. And so we actually do have quite a bit of silicon design. And again, integration between the hardware and the software in the whole vertical stack, that's what makes it very powerful.
Talk to us about what you're going to be able to do differently in a space like this. I think November was when you were first moving in. I was getting a bit of a tour and overview earlier about how artificial intelligence is going to allow you to better predict what happens next when something goes wrong or there's a performance issue, maybe with compute, how that's going to affect storage and allow to
fix that before it becomes a bigger problem. What have you seen so far in the potential of this kind of space to help Microsoft?
Yeah, this space is awesome. 8,000 square feet. We call it the Collaboration Center because it's much more around bringing our engineers together to handle problems. Let me give you a concrete example. Last fall, there was typhoon season in the Asia-Pacific region. Because of the storm, there was damage to subsea cables. We actually lost 5 cables just in the course of 1 week. Now, we had plenty of extra capacity. Our customers never actually even noticed that, but we were able to use the center here to be able to track the storm, figure out what was going on, and bring up some additional capacity as well. And so it's really great just to be able to bring people together very quickly, move through it, and solve problems.
There are a lot of different data center regions and data centers up on that board. The protectionist political environment that we're seeing spring up around the world, is that requiring you to need to build more of those because more countries want to have them local?
Well, we've got 50 regions around the world, which is just a massive footprint. As you mentioned, we're on 6 continents. I hope to get to Antarctica at some point, but we're not quite there yet, but we're going to go get there at some point. But when you look at it, data sovereignty is clearly one of the interests that we have. And so we have our European data centers. We're in China. We're in Australia. Again, 50 regions around the world. But we also invested heavily in hybrid, which means we can do things like Azure Stack. So frankly, if you wanted to run a private cloud in the basement of your parliament, you could actually do that as well.
I guess you'll save a lot on cooling in that Antarctica data center. Jason, thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting that Microsoft has come so far, particularly, I mean, it's funny about the stock market. Part of it is based on revenues and profits, but a large part of it is based on what's called the multiple, just how much people are willing to pay for future earnings, how great they think you have the potential to be. Under the previous CEO, Microsoft just wasn't getting that much of a multiple. But now, I mean, yes, it's doing well revenue-wise and profit-wise, but it's got a story that people believe, and that's a big part of the reason why the stock is in the mid-90s, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, they just reported, obviously, their financial results. That was just last week, and I broke that on air, and it was so clear, John, right away. I mean, the primary drivers of that cloud biz, as analysts were very quick to point out, Azure, Office 365 were just running full speed ahead. You know, I remember the commercial cloud revenue at this point, it clocked in at $6 billion, expanding gross margins. It is easy to see, to your point, why investors like that story.
Yeah. Okay, before we go, I want to hit a couple of the comments, tweets that we got coming in. Thomas Zaleski asked, when will analysts and talking heads return to fundamentals? Valuations among FANG are not sustainable and unrealistic. I want to say, Thomas, slow your roll a little bit there. I mean, there's a wide divergence in the story in FANG. You've got Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Alphabet, Google in there. Sure, when it comes to Amazon, if you're looking at it on an earnings basis, the multiple might be rich. If it's a revenue multiple, it's a little bit different. Sure, Facebook had been trading pretty high up there, but it came down a bit. Netflix is the one that is really, really getting a rich valuation. Apple, I mean, this is the richest company in the world. It's got a unique product, and it's still facing a lot of headwinds of doubt. So not your classic story about being overestimated, too high valuation. Another comment here for a tech to use so much on share buybacks instead of R&D is a crime against evolution, a crime against future generations. Look, I remember being at Fortune and writing my first stories about Apple's cash hoard back when it was in the $15 billion range, and people were saying, what are they going to do with all this money? Now it's more than 10 times that. So I don't know that you have to worry so much about is Apple spending too much on buybacks. Their problem isn't money. If anything, it's focus. Are they buying the right things? Are they spending their time on the right things? Are they doing too much? So some companies need to worry about cash. This just isn't one of those companies. Josh, I'll give you the last word.
No, I think you're right, John. Listen, we had analysts on CNBC today feeling that same question. You know, after you come out with a $100 billion buyback program, you're going to get that question. It seemed to be that analysts who cover this name, and not necessarily bulled up, I mean, just men and women who cover the name and know the company well, did think that the kind of cash hoard Tim Cook is sitting on, that affords you the opportunity to do a lot of buybacks and a lot of R&D. You can do a lot of things with that kind of mountain.
All right, we will leave it there. Josh Lipton, thanks for joining me. West Coast edition of Fort Knox. sunny out here. I like that. John?